At 6:01 in the morning on May 24, 1941, a single German shell fired from more than 9 miles away actually found the one vulnerable spot on the most celebrated warship in the entire Royal Navy, a vessel that had already spent more than 2 decades embodying British naval power in the eyes of ordinary citizens across the entire country. Less than 3 minutes later, HMS Hood no longer existed. 1,415 men died in that same span of time, and only 3 actually survived to describe what they had witnessed. This is the story of how HMS Hood actually exploded, and the specific design decision made more than 2 decades earlier that finally caught up with her on a single catastrophic morning in the Denmark Strait. Every week we take apart a moment when a war turned, the technology that decided it, and the razor-thin margin between disaster and victory. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. Hood had actually entered Royal Navy service in 1920, a battlecruiser design that traced its own origins directly back to lessons the Royal Navy had already drawn from the First World War. A hybrid concept combining a battleship's own considerable firepower with a cruiser's own greater speed, achieved specifically by accepting thinner deck armor than a genuine battleship of comparable size would have actually carried. That same design trade-off had already proven catastrophic once before at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, where 3 British battlecruisers built around broadly similar assumptions had already exploded and sunk after German shells actually penetrated their own thin deck armor and ignited stored ammunition. Disasters that had already prompted considerable Royal Navy debate about whether the entire battlecruiser concept actually represented sound naval architecture at all. Hood herself was laid down after Jutland, specifically incorporating some additional armor improvements informed by those same earlier losses. Yet the ship's own fundamental design compromise, speed and firepower, prioritized over the kind of deck protection a genuine battleship actually carried, remained essentially unresolved by the time she actually entered active service. The 3 battlecruisers actually lost at Jutland, HMS Indefatigable, HMS Queen Mary, and HMS Invincible, had each exploded in remarkably similar circumstances. German shells penetrating thin deck or turret armor and igniting stored cordite propellant, then detonated the ship's own main magazines in a single catastrophic chain reaction. Naval architects and officers across the entire Royal Navy had already debated those specific losses extensively in the years immediately following Jutland, some arguing the underlying battlecruiser concept itself represented a fundamentally flawed compromise between speed and protection that no amount of subsequent design refinement could actually fully correct. Others maintaining the specific losses reflected correctable flaws in propellant handling procedures rather than any inherent flaw in the broader ship type itself. That same unresolved debate shaped Hood's own design directly, since she was actually laid down in September of 1916, mere months after Jutland had already occurred, giving her own design team genuine opportunity to actually incorporate additional armor improvements informed by those same fresh losses, even as the ship's own fundamental battlecruiser concept and its own underlying vulnerability to plunging fire against thin deck armor remained essentially unchanged from the flawed design philosophy that had already destroyed 3 comparable vessels only months earlier. Before we get into exactly how that same 20-year-old design compromise actually caught up with her, if you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. Hood's own celebrity status across the interwar period actually made her destruction considerably more psychologically devastating to the British public than the raw casualty numbers alone might have otherwise suggested to anyone unfamiliar with exactly how thoroughly the ship had already embedded itself in British national identity. The vessel had led the Royal Navy's own elaborate Empire cruise across 1923 and 1924, traveling more than 38,000 nautical miles across a deliberate diplomatic and public relations tour specifically designed to actually showcase British naval power to colonies, allies, and potential rivals scattered across the entire globe. That same extended public exposure meant ordinary British civilians had actually seen Hood, photographed alongside her, and read about her exploits across newspapers for nearly 2 entire decades before the war even began, transforming what was, at its core, a single aging warship into something considerably closer to a living national symbol most Britons actually believed represented their own country's continued naval supremacy. By 1941, naval planners within the Admiralty already understood Hood urgently needed a substantial modernization program specifically addressing her own aging armor scheme, a comprehensive refit repeatedly scheduled and repeatedly postponed across the preceding several years because the ship remained too operationally valuable to actually withdraw from active service for the extended period any genuine modernization would have actually required. That same postponement meant Hood entered her own final engagement, still carrying essentially the deck armor scheme originally designed decades earlier. A ship whose own vulnerability was already documented and already understood at the highest levels of British naval planning well before Bismarck ever actually appeared on the horizon that specific May morning. The Battle of the Denmark Strait actually began at 5:52 that morning, Hood opening fire first, followed 30 seconds later by her considerably newer companion HMS Prince of Wales, a battleship so recently commissioned that Vickers Armstrong technicians remained aboard, actively working through mechanical problems with her own main battery guns, even as the ship actually entered combat. Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen returned fire roughly 3 minutes afterward, and by approximately 6 o'clock, Bismarck's own fifth salvo actually found Hood's specific vulnerability, a shell descending at the steep plunging angle long-range naval gunfire naturally produce, striking exactly the kind of thin deck armor a genuine battleship would have never actually left so exposed. Here is what that specific hit actually did once it penetrated Hood's own deck. The most probable sequence of events established through both contemporary inquiry testimony and considerably more recent wreck examination holds that Bismarck's shell actually detonated Hood's own 4-inch anti-aircraft magazine first, a smaller explosion that immediately propagated into the considerably larger adjacent 15-inch magazine housing the main battery's own primary ammunition supply. That chain reaction detonated roughly 100 tons of stored explosive charge in a single catastrophic instant, an explosion powerful enough to actually break the ship's own hull directly in two, her bow section briefly jutting sharply upward out of the water before the entire vessel actually disappeared beneath the surface in well under 3 minutes from the moment the fatal shell had actually struck. Witnesses aboard Prince of Wales, sailing close enough to observe the entire sequence, directly described an explosion erupting somewhere between Hood's own X-turret and her mainmast, a fireball that consumed the ship so completely and so suddenly that German gunners aboard Bismarck reportedly required a genuine moment to actually process what they had just witnessed before shifting their own fire directly onto Prince of Wales instead. Admiral Lancelot Holland, commanding the British squadron from Hood's own bridge, died instantly alongside nearly the entire ship's company, the catastrophic speed of the explosion leaving essentially no time for any organized evacuation or damage control response any crew, however well trained, could have realistically actually mounted under those specific circumstances. 3 men actually survived Hood's destruction: Midshipman William Dundas, able seaman Robert Tilburn, and signalman Edward Briggs, each thrown clear of the sinking ship by the force of the explosion itself rather than through any deliberate escape. The 3 men spent roughly 3.5 hours in the frigid North Atlantic water before the destroyer HMS Electra actually located and rescued them, the survivors reportedly singing to stay conscious and to stay awake as hypothermia steadily set in during that same extended wait for rescue. Out of a crew that had numbered 1,418 men that specific morning, those 3 survivors represented the entire human remainder of what had only minutes earlier been the largest and most celebrated warship in the Royal Navy's own entire fleet. Bismarck's own gunnery performance during that specific engagement deserves separate attention as well, since German fire control had actually straddled Hood accurately within the first several salvos of the entire engagement, a demonstration of considerable gunnery precision at extreme range that itself became a subject of extensive post-war naval analysis. German naval gunnery training throughout the interwar period had specifically emphasized rapid, accurate ranging at exactly this kind of extended distance and Bismarck's own fire control system, incorporating some of the most advanced optical range-finding technology available to any navy at the time, allowed her own gunnery officers to actually adjust fire with a speed and precision that gave Hood's own crew remarkably little time to actually maneuver evasively before the fatal salvo had already found its own mark. That specific technical advantage, combined with Hood's own already compromised deck armor, meant the engagement's own outcome depended considerably less on pure chance than popular retellings of the battle sometimes suggest. A genuine convergence of German technical proficiency and a British design flaw that had already been documented and understood for years before either factor actually combined to produce the catastrophic result. The broader naval architecture debate, Hood's own loss reignited, extended well beyond the Royal Navy alone, since every major naval power operating comparable battlecruiser or fast battleship designs actually took direct note of exactly what had happened in the Denmark Strait and adjusted their own subsequent design priorities accordingly. American naval planners already working on the Iowa-class battleships, this channel has already covered in considerable detail, specifically prioritized deck armor protection against exactly this kind of plunging fire threat, informed directly by Hood's own documented vulnerability and the specific lessons naval architects worldwide had already drawn from her catastrophic loss. That same influence meant Hood's own destruction, however devastating to Britain in the immediate aftermath, actually shaped naval ship design across multiple Allied nations for the remainder of the entire war, a genuine technical legacy considerably more consequential than the single engagement's own immediate tactical outcome alone might otherwise suggest. This is not a story about a single, lucky German shell simply catching an otherwise invulnerable warship by pure chance, since Hood's own specific vulnerability to exactly this kind of plunging fire had already been documented, discussed, and scheduled for correction well before Bismarck ever actually fired a single shot in her direction. It is a story about how thoroughly a design compromise made in the aftermath of one war can remain dangerously unresolved decades later. A ship celebrated across the entire interwar period as a symbol of British naval power, still carrying beneath her own imposing silhouette essentially the same deck armor limitation that had already destroyed 3 comparable ships at Jutland a full generation earlier. The Admiralty's own formal response arrived almost immediately. Every available British warship in the region ordered to actually locate and destroy Bismarck regardless of cost, a pursuit that would actually culminate 3 days later when British forces finally caught and sank the German battleship on May 27th, more than 2,000 German sailors dying in that same subsequent engagement. That specific sequence, Hood's own catastrophic loss followed within days by Bismarck's own destruction, meant the entire Denmark Strait engagement and its own immediate aftermath actually claimed nearly 3,500 lives across both navies combined within barely a single week of continuous naval combat. 2 separate British inquiries actually investigated Hood's own loss in the following months. The second and considerably more thorough investigation held that September, incorporating testimony from more than 100 separate witnesses across both surviving crew members and observers aboard nearby ships. Both inquiries ultimately reached broadly the same conclusion already understood informally within days of the actual sinking, that a magazine explosion, most likely originating in the smaller 4-inch magazine before propagating into the larger 15-inch magazine adjacent to it, had actually destroyed the ship. Though considerable scholarly and technical debate about the exact precise sequence of that same explosion continued for decades afterward among naval historians and technical experts studying the surviving evidence. The wreck itself remained entirely unexamined for more than 5 decades after the actual sinking, submerged more than 9,000 feet beneath the surface of the Denmark Strait, until a dedicated expedition finally located and surveyed the wreck site in 2001, specifically to actually help resolve the remaining technical questions surrounding exactly how the fatal explosion had actually unfolded. That same expedition adopted a deliberate policy of observation without physical disturbance, examining the wreck purely through remote camera footage, out of explicit respect for the site's own status as a war grave, still containing the remains of the overwhelming majority of Hood's own lost crew, a designation the Royal Navy and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission continue to formally maintain and protect to the present day. Hood's own place in British public memory has actually persisted well beyond the immediate wartime generation that first experienced her loss directly, the ship's own story continuing to feature prominently across documentaries, museum exhibitions, and popular naval history writing produced across the following 8 decades since her actual sinking. The HMS Hood Association, formed specifically by surviving family members and naval historians dedicated to preserving the ship's own memory, continues maintaining detailed records of the crew's own individual service histories, ensuring that each of the 1,415 men who actually died that morning remains individually documented rather than simply reduced to an aggregate casualty statistic in the broader historical record. That same organization played a direct, active role in supporting the 2001 wreck survey expedition, working alongside naval historians and marine archaeologists specifically to actually honor the site's own status as a protected war grave, while still advancing genuine historical understanding of exactly how the catastrophic explosion had actually unfolded that specific morning. If you want more stories about the ships that carried a fatal flaw for decades before it actually found them, subscribe and we will keep finding them for you. See you in the next one.